Locked in a cabin with the town's spinster, the cowboy fell harder than anyone expected. The town of Willow Creek was small enough that everyone knew when a chicken went missing or when someone painted their house a new color. It was the kind of place where stories traveled faster than the wind and stayed longer than the winter snow. People did not just know each other's names. They knew each other's past, their habits, and sometimes even their secrets. And in that small town lived Clara Whitmore. Most people did not say her name with warmth. They said it with a certain tone, a slight lift of the eyebrow, or a quiet whisper. Behind her back, some called her the Spinster. It was not shouted or said cruelly to her face. It was spoken softly in kitchens, in the corner of the general store, or during church gatherings. The word followed her like a shadow. Clara was 34 years old. Willow Creek. That was considered late for a woman to be unmarried. Many girls she had grown up with were already mothers of 3 or 4 children. Some had married right out of school. Others had at least been engaged once or twice. Clara had done none of those things. But what the town did not often remember was that Clara's life had not been like everyone else's. She had grown up in a modest wooden cabin just outside town, nestled between tall pine trees and a narrow dirt road that turned muddy every time it rained. Her father had passed away when she was very young. After that, it had just been Clara and her mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor had been a kind woman, but her health was never strong. As Clara entered her teenage years, her mother's illness became worse. There were days when Eleanor could barely leave her bed. On those days, Clara would wake before sunrise, light the stove, and prepare simple meals. She would fetch water, clean the small house, and make sure her mother was comfortable before walking into town for supplies. While other girls were learning dances and whispering about boys they liked, Clara was learning how to measure medicine and read old recipe books. While others laughed together near the river on warm evenings, Clara sat beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from worn novels by the light of a single lamp. She never complained. Not once. People sometimes praised her for being such a good daughter. They would smile kindly and say, "Your mother is lucky to have you," but after saying those words they would return to their own lives. They would not see the quiet tiredness in Clara's eyes, or the way she sometimes paused at the window, watching groups of young people walk by together. Clara had once received attention from a young man named Thomas Reed. He had been polite and hard-working, with sandy hair and hopeful eyes. He asked her to attend the spring fair with him when she was 21. Clara had wanted to go. She had even taken out her only blue dress and held it against herself in the mirror. But that same week, her mother fell seriously ill. Clara stayed home. Thomas waited at the fair entrance for nearly an hour before leaving. He never asked again. Within a year, he had married someone else. Moments like that shaped Clara's life. One by one, chances passed quietly by her door, and she let them go without bitterness. Her mother needed her. That was reason enough. Years slipped by the way seasons do in a small town, slow but certain. Clara's hair grew longer, her face became more mature. The laughter she once shared easily became softer, less frequent. Her world remained small. The cabin, the town store, the church on Sundays. Some people began to wonder why she never tried harder to find a husband. They assumed she was too serious, too quiet, perhaps too proud. A few said she had missed her chance. Others decided she must not be interested in marriage at all. No one truly asked her. Then, on a cool autumn morning, Eleanor Whitmore passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was simple. The town showed up, as small towns always do in times of loss. There were casseroles brought to the cabin and gentle pats on Clara's shoulder. Many said, "You must be relieved in a way. You've done your duty." Others added, "Now you can start your own life." But Clara did not feel relief. She felt silence. The cabin, once filled with the soft sounds of her mother's breathing and occasional coughing, became unbearably quiet. At night, the ticking clock seemed louder than ever. The wind brushing against the windows felt colder. For months, Clara moved through her days like someone walking through fog. She kept the cabin clean. She tended to a small garden behind the house. She began sewing clothes for neighbors to earn a little money. She visited town when necessary but returned home quickly. Without meaning to, she withdrew further from everyone. It was easier that way. In town, conversations often paused when she approached. Not always, but often enough. She would sense it, the slight shift in tone, the curious looks. She imagined the thoughts. There goes Clara Whitmore, still alone. Poor thing. Clara was not unhappy in the way people assumed. Yes, she felt lonely at times. Yes, there were evenings when she sat by the fireplace and wondered what her life might have been like if things had been different. but she also carried a quiet strength. She knew how to manage a home. She knew how to repair a loose board on the porch and how to stack firewood neatly before winter. She could cook hearty meals from simple ingredients. She read books about history, farming, and even business. Her mind was sharper than many realized, but she did not boast about any of it. In a town that valued loud personalities and bold confidence, Clara's quiet nature was often mistaken for weakness. Children sometimes waved at her as she passed, and she always waved back with a gentle smile. Older women nodded politely. Men tipped their hats out of respect, but rarely lingered in conversation. She became part of the background of Willow Creek, familiar, dependable, and largely overlooked. Still, there were moments when something in her stirred. Sometimes when she walked through town at sunset, she would hear music drifting from the saloon. Laughter would spill into the street. For a brief second, she would pause. Her heart would tighten, not with jealousy, but with curiosity. What would it feel like, she wondered, to be chosen? Not out of duty, not out of sympathy, but truly chosen. She would shake off the thought and continue walking. Winter approached faster than expected that year. The air turned sharp and biting. Pine trees swayed under heavy gray skies. Clara prepared carefully, as she always did. She sealed cracks in the cabin walls, stacked extra wood inside, and stored dried food in jars along the kitchen shelf. She had learned long ago that survival required preparation. One afternoon, while gathering the last of her laundry from the line, she noticed dark clouds rolling in from the north. The wind carried a strange chill. Snow began to fall earlier than anyone predicted. By nightfall, the storm had grown fierce. Snowflakes turned thick and relentless, covering the ground in white within hours. The wind howled against the cabin like it was trying to force its way inside. Clara secured the shutters and added more wood to the fire. She was not afraid. Storms were part of life here, but as she stood by the window watching the snow swirl wildly in the darkness, she felt something else, a sense that change was coming. She could not explain it. The town saw her as a woman whose story had already been written, a quiet life, a lonely cabin, no grand romance, no dramatic turn. But life has a way of surprising even the most certain expectations. As the storm raged outside and the world turned white, Clara Whitmore had no idea that before the night was over, someone would knock on her door, and the life she had quietly accepted would begin to shift in ways no one in Willow Creek could have imagined. The storm did not arrive gently. It came like a wall of white, swallowing the sky and the earth in a matter of hours. By late evening, Willow Creek had disappeared under heavy snow. The dirt roads were no longer visible. Fences were buried halfway. The pine trees bent low under the weight of ice. Inside her cabin, Clara Whitmore moved calmly from one task to another. She placed another log into the fire and adjusted the kettle hanging above it. The warm glow of the flames painted soft shadows on the wooden walls. The wind pushed hard against the windows, making them rattle in sharp bursts. Every now and then, snow hit the glass with a soft thud. Clara had seen storms before. Living just outside town meant she had learned to rely on herself. She had extra blankets folded neatly on a chair. Jars of dried beans, flour, and preserved vegetables lined the kitchen shelf. Water buckets were filled before sunset. She believed in being ready. Still, there was something different about this storm. The wind did not pause. It howled constantly, like it was searching for something. The snow kept falling, thick and endless. Clara stepped toward the small front window and tried to see past the blur of white. The narrow road that connected her cabin to town was gone, hidden under layers of fresh snow. Anyone caught outside tonight would be in trouble. She pulled the curtains closed and returned to the fire. Sitting in her wooden chair, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened a book. Reading had always been her comfort. The simple act of turning pages helped quiet her thoughts. But even the words on the page could not fully distract her from the storm's force. Hours passed. The fire crackled steadily. The cabin felt warm despite the cold pressing from outside. Clara had just begun to feel drowsy when a sudden sound broke through the wind. A loud knock. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. The storm was noisy. Branches could hit the door. The wind could throw loose objects against the walls. Then it came again. Her heart began to pound. No one ever visited this late, especially not during a storm like this. Slowly, she stood up. She grabbed the lantern from the table and moved toward the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice steady but cautious. There was a pause, then a familiar voice answered through the wind. "It's Ethan Cole." Clara's eyes widened slightly. Ethan Cole. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that name. He was one of the strongest cowboys in the county. Tall, Broad-shouldered, confident, he worked cattle, made good money, and carried himself like a man who feared nothing. Some admired him, some envied him. Many young women had once hoped he would choose them. Clara had never expected him to stand outside her door. She unlatched it carefully and pulled it open against the strong wind. Snow rushed in immediately, cold and sharp. Ethan stood there, covered in white from head to boots. His hat was nearly buried under snow, and his coat looked stiff with ice. Behind him, a dark horse stood trembling. "I need shelter," he said quickly. "The trail disappeared. I can't see a thing." "Bring the horse to the side shed," she said. "There's space." Ethan led his horse around the cabin while Clara held the lantern high. Snow stung her face, but she ignored it. Once the animal was secured and covered as best as possible, they hurried back inside. Clara shut the door firmly and slid the bolt into place. For a second they simply stood there. Ethan removed his hat and shook off snow. Melted drops fell onto the wooden floor. His breathing was heavy from the cold. "Thank you," he said, looking at her properly now. "I didn't think I'd make it." "You're lucky you saw the cabin light," Clara replied softly. He nodded. "If not for that, I'd still be out there riding in circles." "Dry off near the fire. I'll heat more water." He moved closer to the fireplace, holding his hands out toward the flames. The warmth slowly returned color to his face. Clara placed the kettle back on the heat and poured him a cup of hot tea. For a while, neither of them spoke much. The storm filled the silence. The wind continued to roar outside as if reminding them how close danger had been. Ethan finally glanced toward the window. "This won't clear by morning," he said. "It's building stronger. It's already covered the road. Even if it stops tonight, the snow will be too deep. That means I might be stuck here." The words hung in the air. Stuck here. Clara felt a strange mix of surprise and awareness. She had grown used to being alone in this cabin. Now, suddenly, the town's most confident cowboy was sitting by her fire. "You can stay," she said calmly. "There's a spare blanket and space near the hearth." Ethan studied her expression. He seemed almost unsure of how to act. In town, conversations between them had never gone beyond polite greetings. He likely knew of the whispers about her just as she knew of his reputation for avoiding commitment. "Appreciated," he replied. Clara busied herself preparing a simple meal of soup and bread. She moved smoothly around the kitchen, used to working alone. Ethan watched quietly, noticing how organized everything was. The cabin, though small, felt warm and steady. Nothing was out of place. "You live out here alone?" he asked. "Yes." "Not afraid?" She glanced at him briefly. "Of what?" He did not answer right away. Perhaps he expected her to say something about wild animals or storms. Instead, her calm question made him rethink his assumption. After they finished eating, Clara spread extra blankets near the fire for him. The storm outside only grew louder. Snow piled against the door. The windows were almost completely covered. By midnight, it was clear. Leaving was impossible. The next morning, Ethan woke early. For a moment, he seemed confused, as if trying to remember where he was. The sound of wind had not stopped. He stood and carefully pulled back a corner of the curtain. All he saw was white. The snow had buried the lower half of the cabin. The shed was barely visible. The road was gone entirely. "We're not getting out today," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. The realization settled between them. Two people who barely knew each other, alone in a cabin, surrounded by endless snow. The town was miles away, cut off completely. There would be no quick escape, no easy return to routine. As the second day began, they both understood something simple but powerful. The storm had locked them in. And with nowhere to go and no one else around, silence would not be enough anymore. Conversation would come. Questions would rise. Assumptions would fade. Outside, the world was frozen and wild. Inside, something entirely different was beginning. The second morning inside the cabin felt different from the first. The storm had not stopped. Snow continued to fall in thick waves, covering everything in sight. The world outside was silent except for the wind. No wagons, no voices, no signs of life. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the small cabin felt warmer than before. Clara woke early, as she always did. She moved quietly so she would not disturb Ethan, who was still asleep near the hearth. For a moment she paused and looked at him. He seemed less bold in sleep, less guarded. Without his hat and boots, he looked almost younger. She quickly looked away and began her morning routine. She added wood to the fire, boiled water, and prepared simple breakfast: eggs, bread, and tea. The familiar tasks helped calm her thoughts, She reminded herself that this situation was temporary. The storm would pass. He would leave. Life would return to normal. But something inside her felt unsettled. Ethan woke to the smell of food. He sat up, rubbing his eyes slightly before remembering where he was. His gaze moved around the cabin, then landed on Clara standing by the stove. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied, without turning fully toward him. He stood and stretched. "Still snowing?" "Yes." He walked to the window and wiped away some frost with his hand. Outside was nothing but white and gray sky. "I've seen bad storms," he said quietly, "but this one's stubborn. Then we'll have to be more stubborn." He glanced at her, surprised by her tone. There was no fear in her voice, no complaint, just steady calm. They sat across from each other to eat. At first, conversation was simple. Talk about the storm, about how deep the snow might be, about the horse in the shed. But as hours passed, silence began to feel heavier. Ethan was not used to being still for this long. His life was movement, riding across fields, working cattle, meeting traders. He rarely spent time sitting inside, especially not with someone he barely knew. Clara, on the other hand, was used to quiet days. But this was different too. She was not alone with her thoughts. She was aware of someone else's presence, someone observing her. By midday, the fire needed more wood. Clara grabbed her coat. "I'll bring some in," she said. Ethan stood immediately. I'll do it. You're the guest. And you've done enough," he replied firmly. Before she could argue, he stepped outside. The wind hit him hard, but he pushed through the snow toward the woodpile. Clara watched through the window. He moved with strength and determination, lifting heavy logs with ease. Within minutes, he returned, boots covered in snow. "You shouldn't go out alone in this," he said as he set the wood down. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "I've managed many winters." "I don't doubt that," he said quickly. "Just saying it's rough out there." She nodded, but something about his tone made her curious. It sounded less like pride and more like concern. Later that afternoon, boredom began to creep in. There was only so much staring at falling snow one could do. Clara reached for a book from the shelf. "You read much?" she asked casually. Ethan gave a small shrug. "Not much time for it." "You have time now." He hesitated, then took it. He sat near the fire and opened it, clearly unfamiliar with sitting still long enough to read. At first, he shifted often, cleared his throat, turned pages too quickly. But slowly, something changed. The cabin grew quiet except for the crackling fire and the soft sound of pages turning. Clara watched him from the kitchen table while sewing a torn cloth. She noticed the way his eyebrows furrowed when concentrating, the way he leaned slightly forward, fully focused. It surprised her. He did not seem like the type to care about stories. After some time, he closed the book gently. "That was interesting," he admitted. She smiled faintly. "Books can take you places when you can't go anywhere. You must travel a lot then." She understood what he meant. She lived alone, in the same place, year after year. "I do," she said softly, "in my own way." For the first time, he noticed details he had ignored before. The cabin was small but organized. Every item had a purpose. The shelves were filled with more than cookbooks. There were books about farming, business, history. "You read all these?" he asked. "Yes," Clara set her sewing down. "Because learning is something no one can take from you." As evening approached, the wind began to calm slightly. Not enough to clear the roads, but enough to reduce the howling noise. With less sound outside, the silence between them felt more noticeable. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did," she replied lightly. A small smile appeared on his face. "Why didn't you ever leave this place?" She knew what he meant. Why didn't she leave town? Why didn't she start fresh somewhere new? "My mother needed me," she said simply. "And after?" She hesitated. "After? I suppose I didn't see a reason." "No reason?" he repeated, almost confused. "This is my home," she said. "People assume I stayed because I had no choice. But sometimes staying is also a choice." Her honesty caught him off guard. In town, most conversations were shallow. Quick jokes, loud laughter. But this felt different. He looked down at his hands. "People talk, you know." "I know," she replied calmly. "Doesn't it bother you?" "But you can't control what others say, only how you live." Her answer lingered in the air. Ethan had spent years building his image. Strong, independent, unattached. He had cared deeply about how others saw him. "You're not what people think," he said quietly. She gave a small smile. "No one ever is." That evening, as darkness settled, something subtle shifted. The awkwardness that filled the first day was fading. In its place was curiosity. Ethan found himself asking more questions about her childhood, about the books she loved, about the garden behind the cabin. She answered openly, without exaggeration or self-pity. She told him about staying up late reading to her mother. About learning to repair broken furniture because there was no one else to do it. About watching seasons change from her window. There was no bitterness in her voice, only strength. And that strength surprised him most of all. He had always believed boldness was loud. That confidence meant speaking the most and laughing the hardest. But Clara's confidence was quiet. Did not demand attention. It simply existed. As the fire burned low, they sat closer to keep warm, not touching. Just near enough to feel each other's presence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Respect. Not the kind earned through physical strength or success, but the kind built slowly through resilience and honesty. He looked at her differently now. Not as the town's forgotten woman, not as the quiet figure walking alone, but as someone who had carried more responsibility than most and never asked for praise. Outside, snow continued to blanket the world. Inside, assumptions were slowly melting away. Neither of them said it out loud, but both felt it. The storm had locked them in together. And in that forced stillness, the truth about who Clara Whitmore really was had begun to unfold. And Ethan Cole was seeing her clearly for the very first time. By the third day, the storm had softened, but it had not fully stopped. The wind was no longer roaring, yet the snow lay deep and heavy around the cabin. The world outside looked still, almost frozen in time. The sky was pale, and everything was covered in bright white. Inside the cabin, something else had changed too. The space no longer felt awkward or unfamiliar. It felt shared. Ethan woke before Clara that morning. He lay quietly for a moment, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire. He was not used to waking up in the same place for 3 days straight without riding out at sunrise. His body felt restless, but his mind felt strangely calm. He turned his head slightly and saw Clara asleep in her small bed across the room. Her face looked peaceful. The soft morning light touched her features, and for a second he found himself studying her without meaning to. She did not look like the version of her that the town described. There was no sign of loneliness carved into her face. No bitterness, just quiet strength. He quickly looked away when she began to stir. Clara opened her eyes slowly, adjusting to the light. When she noticed Ethan already awake, she gave a polite nod. "Good morning." She stood and began preparing breakfast again. The routine felt natural now. There was no tension in their movements. They worked around each other easily, as if they had done this before. After eating, Ethan pulled on his coat. "I'll check on the horse," he said. Clara followed him to the door. When he opened it, the cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. The storm had clearly passed during the night. The sky was brighter, though thick snow still covered everything. Ethan stepped out carefully, boots sinking deep with each step. Clara watched from the doorway. The snow reached nearly to his knees in some places. The road was completely buried. He returned a few minutes later, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Horse is fine," he said, "but we're not going anywhere today either." She had expected that answer. The reality of staying longer settled in. They would have another full day together. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself noticing things about Clara that he had overlooked for years. The way she moved with quiet purpose, the way she thought before she spoke, the way she never complained about the storm, even though it had trapped her just as much as him. He leaned against the table and crossed his arms. "You've handled this pretty well." She glanced up from kneading dough. "Handled what?" "Being stuck with me," he said with a half-smile. She almost laughed. "You're not that difficult." "That's not what people usually say." She stopped for a moment and looked at him directly. "People say many things." Huh. There was something in her tone that made him pause. Ethan had always cared about his image. He liked being seen as strong and independent. He enjoyed the admiration, even if he never admitted it openly. But standing there in the small cabin, none of that seemed important. "What do they say about me?" he asked. She wiped flour from her hands before answering. "That you don't stay long in one place. That you don't believe in settling down." "And you believe that?" "I believe actions speak louder than rumors." The answer was simple, but it carried weight. For the first time, Ethan felt slightly uncomfortable, not because she was judging him, but because she wasn't. She was simply stating facts without emotion. He moved closer to the fire and sat down. Maybe they're right, he admitted quietly. Clara looked surprised. About what? About me not staying. She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. Why don't you? He stared at the flames for a long moment before answering. Because staying means choosing, and choosing means committing. And that frightens you? He let out a short breath. I don't get frightened. She tilted her head slightly. Everyone does. There was no challenge in her voice. Just understanding. He looked at her again. Really looked at her. There was no teasing. No attempt to impress him. She spoke honestly, without trying to win anything. Maybe I just never met someone worth choosing, he said finally. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Silence followed. Clara did not react the way other women might have. She did not blush or smile proudly. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then looked down. Sometimes, she said softly, we don't recognize worth when it's quiet. The rest of the afternoon felt different. There was an unspoken awareness between them now. Not tension. Not discomfort. Just something new. They played a simple card game she found in a drawer. Ethan laughed when he lost, claiming she must be cheating. She teased him gently, and the sound of her laughter filled the cabin again. He realized something then. He had never heard her laugh in town. In Willow Creek, she walked with her head slightly lowered, speaking only when necessary. But here, inside her cabin, she seemed lighter. You're different here, he said. This is my home, she replied. People are different where they feel safe. That word, safe, echoed in his mind. Did she feel safe now? As evening approached, they prepared dinner together. Ethan insisted on helping. He chopped vegetables unevenly, and she corrected him with patient guidance. Their hands brushed once while reaching for the same spoon. Both of them pulled back slightly, surprised by the small spark of awareness. Neither mentioned it. After dinner, the cabin grew quiet again. The sky outside turned deep blue, and the snow reflected the moonlight. They sat close to the fire. Ethan cleared his throat. Can I ask you something personal? You already have, she replied with a faint smile. He leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you ever marry? It was a bold question. Clara did not answer immediately. She stared into the flames, thinking carefully. Life required something different from me, she said finally. And by the time I looked up, years had passed. That's not a real answer. It's the honest one. There was no regret there, just acceptance. Didn't you ever want more? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. Of course I did. Everyone wants to be seen, to be chosen. But wanting something doesn't mean you chase it at any cost. Her honesty hit him harder than he expected. He thought about all the times he had walked away from women who cared for him. All the times he convinced himself that staying would trap him, that commitment would limit his freedom. But sitting there now, he did not feel trapped. He felt grounded. I used to think love slowed a man down, he admitted quietly. And now? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Now I'm not so sure. The air between them shifted again. The storm outside had passed, but another kind of storm was building inside him. It wasn't wild or destructive. It was steady and growing, like a realization he could no longer ignore. He admired her, not just for her kindness, not just for her strength, but for her quiet courage, for the way she had faced years of whispers and loneliness without becoming bitter, for the way she carried herself with dignity even when overlooked. He had chased excitement his whole life. Fast horses, big deals, loud laughter. But here, in a small wooden cabin buried in snow, he felt something deeper. Peace. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. You know, he said slowly, this isn't what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know, he admitted. Not this. And what is this? He held her gaze. Comfort. The word hung in the warm air. Clara's heart beat a little faster, though her expression stayed calm. She had protected herself for years by expecting nothing from anyone. It was safer that way. But now, sitting across from him, she felt something fragile beginning to grow. Neither of them spoke for a while. The firelight danced across the walls. Outside, the snow rested quietly under the moon. Inside, two people who once barely noticed each other were beginning to see clearly. Ethan had always believed he was too strong to fall for anyone. But strength, he was learning, was not about avoiding feelings. It was about facing them. And as he watched Clara sitting across from him, steady, thoughtful, real, he realized something that unsettled him more than the storm ever had. He did not just respect her. He was beginning to care, deeply. And, for the first time in his life, the idea of staying no longer felt like a trap. The storm had finally passed. The sky was clear and bright blue, and sunlight reflected off the thick blanket of snow, making everything shine. The air looked clean and fresh, but the snow was still deep, too deep to travel easily. Clara stood by the window, holding the curtains slightly open. The sunlight touched her face, and for the first time in days, she felt the quiet after chaos. The wind had stopped. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Behind her, Ethan was pulling on his boots. "Looks like it's over," he said. "Yes," she replied softly. "It is." But both of them knew she wasn't only talking about the storm. Ethan stepped outside to test the snow. Each step sank deep, but the surface had begun to harden under the cold night air. He walked toward the road and tried to see how far the snow stretched. In the distance, he noticed something faint, movement near the main path that led into town. When he returned to the cabin, there was a thoughtful look on his face. "I think they'll start clearing the road today," he said. "By tomorrow, maybe even tonight, we'll be able to leave." For a brief second, neither spoke. The reality of leaving settled heavily between them. For 3 days, the world had been small. Just this cabin, the fire, the snow, and the two of them. There had been no whispers, no curious eyes, no expectations. Just honesty. Now the outside world was slowly returning. Clara turned back toward the stove and began preparing breakfast. She moved with her usual calmness, but something inside her felt tight. She reminded herself that this was temporary from the beginning. He would leave. That was always the plan. He felt something he hadn't expected. Resistance. A strong pull against the idea of walking away and returning to his old routine as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. He could feel it clearly. They ate in silence that morning, though it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence filled with unspoken thoughts. After breakfast, Ethan helped gather the last of the wood and checked on his horse again. Clara folded blankets and tidied the space he had used near the hearth. With every small action, it felt like they were slowly erasing the signs of their shared days. By afternoon, distant sounds reached them. Voices, the faint scraping of metal against snow. Clara moved to the door and opened it slightly. In the distance, several men from town were working together to clear the road with shovels and horses. The path was slowly reappearing. Ethan stepped beside her. "Well," he said quietly, "that's our sign." She nodded, though her hands tightened slightly on the doorframe. Within an hour, 2 men approached the cabin, calling out to check if anyone inside needed help. They looked surprised when Ethan stepped out. "Cole! We'd been wondering where you disappeared to," one of them said. "Got caught in the storm," Ethan replied calmly. "Clara gave me shelter." Both men glanced briefly at Clara standing behind him. Their expressions were curious, maybe even surprised, but they said nothing more than polite greetings. "We'll have the road clear enough soon," one of them added. "You'll be able to head back by evening." After they left, silence returned. The decision stood in front of them now. Ethan went inside and began gathering his things. He brushed off his coat and adjusted his hat. Each movement felt heavier than it should have. Clara stood near the table, watching quietly. "You'll be glad to get back," she said gently. "Your work must be waiting." "Work can wait," he replied. The answer surprised both of them. He stepped closer to her, removing his gloves slowly. "Clara," he began, then paused. He had faced wild horses and tough negotiations without fear, but now, standing in front of her, words felt harder to find. She looked up at him, steady as always. "Yes?" He took a breath. "These past few days, they weren't just about waiting out a storm." She didn't interrupt. "I thought I knew what kind of life I wanted," he continued. "Freedom? No ties. No staying in one place too long. And now?" she asked softly. He held her gaze. "Now I realize I was running from something I didn't understand." The cabin felt warmer despite the cold air drifting in from the door. "I always believed that settling down meant losing something," he said. "But here, I didn't lose anything. I gained something." Her heart began to beat faster, but she kept her expression calm. "You gained what?" she asked. "Perspective," he answered first. Then, more honestly, "and maybe the courage to choose." The word choose hung between them. Clara had once told him that staying was a choice, that real love required courage stronger than pride. He remembered every word. "You deserve more than whispers," he said firmly. "You deserve someone who stands beside you openly." She felt emotion rise in her chest, but she did not let it show too quickly. Years of guarding her heart had taught her patience. "Ethan," she said carefully. When you walk back into town, people will talk. But this time I won't let that decide anything. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see complete sincerity in his eyes. I'm not asking because of a storm, he said. And I'm not speaking out of impulse. I've had 3 days to think, and I've never thought more clearly. Her breath felt steady but deep. I don't want to leave here and pretend this didn't happen, he continued. I don't want to go back to the same old path. I want something real. The simplicity of his words carried more weight than any grand speech. Clara searched his face for hesitation. She found none. For years, she said quietly, I stopped expecting anyone to stay. He nodded slowly. Then let me be the one who does. The road was nearly clear. Ethan reached for her hand. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steady and certain. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment. This was not pity. Not rescue. Not pressure. It was a choice, and after years of being overlooked, she finally felt seen. She squeezed his hand gently. That kind of decision, she said softly, should never be made out of fear. It's made out of clarity. A faint smile touched her lips. By late afternoon, the road was open enough to travel. Several townspeople gathered nearby, curious to see how Ethan would return after disappearing during the storm. When he stepped out of the cabin, hat firmly in place, they greeted him loudly. Glad you made it. Storm nearly swallowed the whole county. He nodded politely, but did not move toward his horse immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the cabin door. Clara stood there, the sunlight behind her, the snow shining around her feet. The town grew quieter, watching. Ethan walked back to her without hesitation. Then, in full view of everyone, he reached for her hand again. Not casually, not secretly, openly. A few murmurs passed through the crowd. But Ethan didn't look at them. He looked at her. Ready? He asked gently. She understood what he meant. Ready to step forward? Ready to face whatever came next? Clara took a slow breath, then nodded. Together they stepped away from the cabin and onto the cleared path. The whispers that once followed her felt smaller now, less powerful, because this time she was not walking alone. And Ethan Cole, the man who once avoided staying anywhere too long, walked beside her with steady purpose. The storm had locked them in, but in that stillness, something stronger had formed. Not sudden passion, but a quiet, steady decision. And sometimes the strongest love stories do not begin with fireworks. They begin with a storm.